Namaskar, this is Akhilesh Bhargava. Welcome to Tit-Bits on Business and Finance with me. By triggering inflation, the Ukraine war has unleashed a serious economic crisis on the global economy. The war is the source of global inflation today. It has disrupted supplies of food, fuel and commodities, and prices have skyrocketed to historic highs in every nation, though some now think that the prices have peaked. We, however, don't think so. Some more inflation is still in the offing. The USA faces the highest ever inflation since the 80s. So does the UK, and so is the WPI in India at its highest in 3 decades. Apart from the fact that persistent inflation erodes household savings and spendings, it is inherently anti-growth in nature. For a nation like India, which heavily depends on oil imports, it means a widening current account deficit, a rising fiscal deficit, a weakening rupee, a dip in consumer demand, and rising inequality in the economy and in society. Battling inflation, therefore, is the main objective of economic policies of nations worldwide today. An interesting article in the Wall Street Journal says that Russia is presently waging 2 wars. A hot war with Ukraine, whose costs are measured in the mindless death and destruction, and a cold war with the West, whose costs are measured in inflation and the economic hardship that it is causing. The Wall Street Journal says that Putin's strategy to victory is to inflict a high enough short-term cost on Western consumers such that political and public support for the Ukraine war will crumble in those nations. At the moment, Putin has failed in his strategy since the common man in the West believes that he will need to bear some cost in order to support Ukraine and to hit back at Russia in this war. A chronic and untamed inflation is to the economy what termites are to wood. Such inflation weakens the macro structure of the economy by eroding overall income as well as expenditure, which are the mainstay of economic activity and its objective also. An era of continued elevated inflation also destroys consumer confidence by building a perception of continued high prices, which is even more riskier to GDP growth. The worldwide response to the inflation spiral has been to curb and to control it as soon as possible so that it does not set in for a long duration and slow down the national and global economy for a long term. Nations like the US and India are battling inflation as their number one enemy, and they are resorting to rapid interest rate hikes and changes in their monetary policies. Even though this inflation is more supply driven than demand driven, except for the temporary impact of the present bout of revenge shopping after 2 years of lockdowns, which is demand driven. Except for this, it is a supply driven inflation, and central banks worldwide, in order to combat it, are in a hurry to increase interest rates to control prices in their nations. The fact, however, is that there are limitations to how effective interest rate hikes can be to battle this kind of a supply driven equation, which is caused by rising food, fuel prices and supply chain disruption. At the recent annual economic policy conference of the ECB at Portugal, which is the European Central Bank, the US Fed Chairman Jerome Powell said that he is more concerned about failing to stamp out high cost inflation than about the possibility of raising interest rates too high and pushing the economy into a recession. He does not even mind a recession as long as the interest rate hikes help to control prices. Mr. Powell said that from the economy's perspective, a bigger mistake would be to failing to restore price stability in the country. He then said that the US Fed is therefore aggressively raising interest rates also because of concerns that higher prices could change consumer psychology in ways that would sustain high inflation. He further mentioned that it is important to ensure that consumers do not expect the high prices to persist. If you do not control prices now, he says, then there is a danger that the economy will transmit into a higher inflation regime for a long period of time, which is even more destructive. He then said that the Fed therefore had to rapidly increase interest rates even if it raises the risk of recession to avoid a bigger danger to the economy, which is high inflation becoming entrenched and thus starting a prolonged downturn in the American economy. The reality is that due to the continued price rise, the US economy has been much weaker than what was estimated earlier, and that confirms Mr. Powell's fears. Consumer spending, which is the main economic engine of America, has been much more softer than what was reported earlier. The consumer spending there grew by a mere 1.8% in the first quarter, as against the earlier estimate of 3.51%, because of which the American economy contracted by 1.6% during this period. The consumers in America are struggling to stomach higher prices, and spending at retail stores recorded an unprecedented fall in the month of May 2022. The short-term outlook of the American consumer has dropped sharply on concerns about inflation, and the Fed's worry is that it should not become a long-term outlook, which is expecting that high prices will persist in the long term. That would change consumer behavior, that would change their spending, and that would impact the economy in the long term. The message of Jerome Powell is that the US Fed will prevent inflation expectations from rising, and that it will help investors to anticipate future interest rate increases. The reality is that if you do not address and curb inflation now, it can lead to a much bigger and worse economic downturn later. And so, the present recession in USA because of interest rate hikes is a better option, even if it leads to loss of jobs and output in the short term. The US Fed will thus keep increasing interest rates till it thinks that inflation is in control. Since March, the Fed has increased interest rates sharply from a near 0% to 1.5 to 1.7% now, after the recent increase of 0.75% in interest rates there. Its largest increase in the last 28 years was this 0.75% increase in one go. The American Central Bank has indicated a further rise in interest rates in its meeting this month, and experts think that the key interest rates in USA will rise up to 3 to 3.5% this year, as against the present rates of 1.5 to 1.75%. A number of interest rate hikes are in the offing there. India's Reserve Bank has been following the footsteps of the US Fed, and it has rapidly increased interest rates since May. In its meeting last month, the MPC further increased the key repo rate by 50 basis points to take it to 4.9%, with its focus being on the withdrawal of monetary accommodation to ensure that going forward, inflation in India remains within the target band of 2 to 6%, and that is not going to happen too soon. The MPC noted with concern in its meeting that the CPI, which is the consumer inflation headline, rose to 7.8% in April from 7% in March because of a broad-based increase in all items in the inflation index, including food and fuel. The Reserve Bank Deputy Governor, Mr. Michael Patra, who is set to helm its monetary policy, later said that inflation is likely to remain over 6% for the next 3 quarters, and that it could take up to 2 years to cool down prices in India. Consumers will need to bear the pain till then. While the US Fed and the Reserve Bank have pressed the panic button and are rapidly increasing the key interest rates, the European Union, however, has been proceeding in a much more careful and calibrated manner. The ECB head, Christine Lagarde, said that moving gradually in the matter of interest rate hikes is much more appropriate in times of such uncertainty, notwithstanding the fact that the Ukraine conflict is driving up energy and commodity prices there, and it is gradually sapping up consumer purchasing power in a region that relies heavily on imported energy. She preferred caution as the ECB gauges the fallout of the war and said that it would gradually raise interest rates in its policy meetings scheduled in July and September this year. Ms. Lagarde, however, said that the ECB would increase interest rates more quickly if it becomes easier to judge the trajectory of the EU economy. At present, the inflation in the Eurozone is at a multi-decade high of 8.1% and its interest rates are still at an average of a negative 0.5%, with the expectation that it will go up by 0.25% in July and maybe more thereafter, depending on, as she said, what will be the trajectory of the Ukraine war. The UK too seems to be waiting and watching and has not rapidly increased its interest rates despite inflation there being at a high of 9%, its highest since 1983. The reality is that the US Fed accepts that to control inflation through interest rate hikes, a recession there is inevitable, which to it is a better bitter pill to swallow than having inflation continuing. In India, instead of a recession, a stagflation to us looks imminent, which is an era of high prices, slow growth, and high joblessness. After the COVID lockdowns, the global economy was expected to normalize in 2 years, which is by 2023. And due to the war now, it will take 2 more years for it to normalize after the Ukraine war ends, which only Putin knows when. And while he doesn't say when it will end or he doesn't end it, he pursues his agenda of a twin hot and cold war, hoping to defeat Ukraine militarily and to defeat the West economically. The fact is that this inflation is eroding economies, and we need to wait and watch and see how long will consumers and nations be able to bear such increase in prices. This is Akhilesh Bhargava signing off till we meet again. Namaskar.